Welcome back to Eigen Designs. Today I'll be making a mahogany butcher block cutting board. In this video, I'll be walking through the steps that I took to make the board, including cutting, planing, and jointing the wood, as well as glue-up sanding and routing. I encountered a few issues with the mahogany that I was working with because there was a lot of stress trapped in the wood. So if you want to see how I overcame some of those issues, stick around and I'll show you how. I began this project by starting off with the 1x6 cherry wood that I had and ripping it into 1.5 inch strips. This part was pretty easy because it was already S4S, so I didn't have to do any milling to it. I just put it on the table saw and began ripping. Once those pieces were cut, I then turned my attention to the mahogany. So this is African mahogany, and the particular piece of board that I was working with ended up having quite a bit of trapped stress inside the wood. So I discovered later, once I was making some of these cuts, that the board began to warp as I was making the cut. So there was some additional machining that had to be done later using both my jointer and my planer. I decided to use mahogany for this particular project because I've been working a lot with walnut and maple, and I just wanted to mix things up and broaden my horizons a little bit. The mahogany was pretty tough. I ended up having to do a blade change on my table saw halfway through this project. Well, I've got the boards cut up now, and I'd like to do an in-grain cutting board, but with a little bit of a twist. Thinking about putting some of this cherry wood in between just as an accent. You'll get something that has this kind of a pattern to it, so you'll have the mahogany, cherry, mahogany, cherry, mahogany, cherry, mahogany. And then once we've glued this up, we can actually cut these into strips and make a nice in-grain pattern with it. But as I'm marrying up these boards, I'm noticing some gaps in the joinery, some pretty significant ones. And if you don't handle this whenever you're before you glue everything up, you're gonna have problems down the road. So if you come in, you see this joint right here is tight on this end, but if you come over here, there's a significant gap, and I think most of it's in the mahogany. I noticed as I was cutting it that as I was running it through the table saw, as I was ripping it, it started to pry apart, indicating that there was some trapped tension within the wood grains itself. And as I have come to rip more of the mahogany, I'm seeing more and more problems. So what I'm going to have to do is take this mahogany through the joiner, which I've got set up right here, and try to fix some of these joints before the glue up. Okay, it's looking much better now. It kind of looks like there's still a gap, but that's just the shadow casting over this piece of cherry because it's just a little bit taller, but all the joints look pretty tight. So we're gonna go ahead and start gluing up and get this in the clamps. As with any in-grain cutting board, there's usually multiple gluing steps that you have to go through. This first step is to glue all the boards together so that you can then turn around and cut the strips, turn them on their side, and then glue them back together. For this glue up, I'm using Titebond 3 and my 18-inch parallel clamps, which help keep the pressure evenly distributed across the entire glue up. Drying times vary, but I try to leave them in the clamps at least a couple hours, if not overnight when possible. It's been about 24 hours since the glue up. Just looking at the joinery right now, and everything's looking really good. So one of the things that I made sure to do whenever I was making this is to have the width of this be less than 13 inches so I can fit this entire board through the thickness planer. So the thickness of the mahogany versus the cherry is a little bit different. These stand proud by about 1 millimeter. So I'll come through and knock this down in the planer, get everything the same thickness before cutting it into strips and starting to arrange the pattern for the cutting board. Once the board was planed on both sides, I used the miter gauge on my table saw to put a nice clean edge on one side of the cutting board. Now this is a little bit embarrassing, but I actually lost the footage of me cutting the strips on my cutting board, so I'm going to have to reference an older build that I did with the cutting board. So this isn't the cutting board for this particular video, but this is what you would do. You take the clean edge that you just put on it using either a crosscut sled or a miter gauge, and then you reference that straight edge against the fence and cut the cutting board into thin strips. These thin strips are going to be used to create the in-grain cutting board in the next step. One important thing to note here is that the thickness that you choose in this step dictates the height of the cutting board. So make sure you select this for the look that you're going for your particular board. Once the strips were cut, we took another trip back to the clamps for the final glue up for this in-grain cutting board. As a design choice, I took every other board and flipped it around the other way so the seams didn't line up. But that's just a design choice, and folks making their own board can use complete creative freedom for whatever they think looks the best. Just make sure that you use enough Titebond 3 glue so you don't have any gaps in your seams. After letting the board dry overnight, I removed it from the clamps the next day, and then took a chisel to remove some of the glue buildup in between the seams. Now, because this is an in-grain cutting board, I do not recommend putting this through the planer again because of the orientation of the grain structure. Makes it really difficult for the planer to handle. So I recommend hand sanding a piece like this, and removing as much of the glue as possible before starting is helpful because it won't gum up the sandpaper that you use in your orbital sander or the hand sander, whatever you choose to use. So once most of the glue was removed, I took the board over to my downdraft table and used my random orbital sander and gradually stepped up the grit of the sandpaper, starting with 80 and then 120 and then eventually 220. In between the 120 and 220 step, I sprayed down the board to raise the grain of the board and then come back with a 220 grit sandpaper later to knock it down. This ensures that the board remains smooth even after it gets wet for the first time. With the sanding complete, I went over to the router table and put a 45-degree chamfered edge on the side of the board. The reason I'm routing after I sand is because I'm trying to preserve that nice, clean, sharp chamfered edge that can sometimes be lost if you do any significant sanding once the edge is put on the board. And finally, I'll be finishing the board with some mineral oil. Mineral oil does a couple of things. It soaks into the grain of the wood, and it's a food-safe material so it prevents juices from meat and other things that you would cut from getting into the board and turning rancid. It also darkens the wood and brings out the rich coloring in the grains, which brings a beautiful appearance and highlights some of the natural beauty in the wood. Enjoy. This is the final product. I'm happy with how it turned out, and one of the unique things about mahogany is it looks red in coloring in some lighting and brown in other lighting, so it's really unique. I also like how the cherry wood provided a nice accent offset to make it stand out a little bit more. Thank you for watching this video and sticking around to the end. I ask that you smash that like button and subscribe, and I'll see you on the next one.